when a sitting American president boards Air Force One and flies to the Arabian Peninsula at a moment when a ceasefire is visibly crumbling, when oil markets are convulsing, when the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed to a fifth of the world's energy supply, and when his own national security team is divided between those who counsel renewed military strikes and those who still believe diplomacy has something left to offer, that journey is not a routine state visit. It is a confession. A confession that the strategy which produced Operation Epic Fury on February 28th of this year, the strategy premised on the assumption that overwhelming military force applied against Iran would generate rapid political capitulation, has not delivered what its architects promised, and that Washington now finds itself in the uncomfortable position of needing its Gulf partners far more urgently than it did when it launched this war without fully consulting them. Donald Trump has arrived in Riyadh, greeted by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman with the kind of elaborate ceremonial welcome, Arabian horses, fighter jet escorts, lavender carpets, that the Saudi leadership deploys when it wishes to signal warmth, while simultaneously reminding its guest of the kingdom's own dignity and sovereign weight. Behind that pageantry, however, lie conversations of extraordinary complexity and consequence. Conversations about whether Saudi Arabia can help construct the diplomatic bridge that American credibility alone can no longer build, and whether the Iran ceasefire, declared by Trump himself to be on massive life support, can be pulled back from the edge of complete collapse before the region slides into another round of devastating military confrontation. To appreciate the full strategic significance of Trump's arrival in Riyadh, one must understand something that the American political conversation has consistently failed to grapple with honestly, which is that Saudi Arabia's relationship with the United States in 2026 is a fundamentally different relationship from what it was even 5 years ago. The kingdom that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman governs today is not the compliant and strategically dependent client state that American foreign policy planners have long assumed it to be. It is a country that has spent the better part of the past decade methodically diversifying its strategic relationships, deepening its economic integration with China through the Belt and Road Initiative, pursuing the historic Chinese-brokered normalization with Iran in 2023 that genuinely shocked Washington, and building military and technological partnerships with a range of powers that give Riyadh genuine strategic options that its predecessors never possessed. This is a Saudi Arabia that has demonstrated, in the most direct and consequential way possible, that Gulf consent to American military operations is no longer automatic. When Trump announced his Project Freedom operation to forcibly reopen the Strait of Hormuz, Saudi Arabia responded by informing Washington that it would not allow American military aircraft to fly from Prince Sultan Air Base or transit Saudi airspace to support the effort. That decision, taken unilaterally, communicated firmly, and maintained until the operation was paused, was one of the most significant developments in the history of the American-Saudi relationship, and it deserves to be understood as such rather than being buried beneath the daily avalanche of ceasefire drama and Truth Social posts that dominates the Western media's coverage of this crisis. The specific mechanics of what happened with Project Freedom illuminate the deeper structural tensions that Trump is now flying to Riyadh to address. According to reporting by NBC News, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states were genuinely surprised by Trump's announcement of the operation. Surprised, that is, because Washington launched it without adequately notifying its key regional allies in advance. This is a pattern that has characterized the Trump administration's approach to Middle Eastern policy throughout this entire crisis, a preference for dramatic unilateral announcements delivered via social media that confront allies with facts on the ground rather than consulting them in advance about the strategic wisdom and operational feasibility of the proposed course of action. The Saudis were not merely offended by the lack of consultation, though they were certainly that. They were genuinely alarmed by the operational risks that Project Freedom posed to Gulf Arab states that share a neighborhood with Iran and that had already absorbed Iranian missile and drone strikes throughout the conflict. A Gulf official who spoke to NBC News put it with admirable directness. The way Project Freedom was to be executed was, in his words, risky and could have triggered escalation that would have been catastrophic for Gulf states. That is the voice of a partner who has concluded that Washington's strategic judgment cannot be trusted unconditionally and who has acted accordingly. Trump arrives in Riyadh, therefore, not as an unquestioned patron dispensing security guarantees to grateful clients, but as a leader who needs to rebuild trust with allies whose confidence in American strategic reliability has been genuinely shaken. The Iran ceasefire itself, the fragile, contested, repeatedly violated arrangement that has been in place since April 8th, represents both the central challenge and the central opportunity of Trump's Middle Eastern tour. The ceasefire has held in the most technical sense, in that the large-scale military operations of the war's opening weeks have not resumed. but it has held in the way that a cracked dam holds, visibly, precariously, and with constant signs of imminent failure. Both sides have continued to fire on each other in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has launched drone strikes on the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar. The United States Navy has fired on Iranian-flagged tankers, attempting to circumvent the American naval blockade. Trump has called Iran's diplomatic counterproposal totally unacceptable and a piece of garbage, declared the ceasefire on massive life support, and indicated that some of his aides are now seriously considering a resumption of major combat operations. Iran's military has warned of surprising options if adversaries make another miscalculation. And through all of this, the Strait of Hormuz has remained effectively closed, costing American households $37 billion in elevated energy prices, pushing Brent crude above $105 per barrel, and threatening the kind of sustained inflationary spiral that the Federal Reserve has been watching with what can only be described as considerable institutional anxiety. This is the situation that Trump has brought with him to Riyadh, and it is a situation that requires something considerably more sophisticated than the blunt, transactional approach that has characterized his administration's diplomatic engagement throughout this crisis. What Saudi Arabia can potentially offer in this context is something of genuine and irreplaceable strategic value, a channel of communication with Tehran that carries credibility precisely because it does not pass through Washington. The kingdom normalized relations with Iran in 2023, and while that normalization has been severely tested by the current conflict, Iran launched missile and drone strikes on Saudi territory during the war, and Riyadh condemned what it called flagrant Iranian aggression in the strongest possible terms. The diplomatic architecture of that relationship has not been entirely destroyed. Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan has maintained communication with his Iranian counterparts throughout the crisis, and Saudi Arabia has consistently positioned itself as supporting de-escalation and negotiation rather than unlimited military escalation. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman reportedly urged Trump earlier in the conflict to keep hitting the Iranians hard, a position that reflected Saudi Arabia's own deep anxieties about Iranian regional influence. But that position has evolved as the costs and risks of the conflict have become clearer, and Riyadh now appears to have concluded that a negotiated settlement, however imperfect, is preferable to a continuation of a war that is destabilizing the entire Gulf region and threatening the economic foundations of Vision 2030, the kingdom's ambitious program of economic diversification and modernization that represents Mohammed bin Salman's primary domestic political legacy. Pakistan's indispensable mediating role in this crisis adds yet another dimension of complexity to the diplomatic landscape that Trump must navigate in Riyadh. Islamabad has been serving as the primary communication channel between Washington and Tehran, a role that reflects Pakistan's unique position as a Muslim-majority state with relationships on multiple sides of the current conflict and a genuine national interest in regional stability that goes well beyond abstract diplomatic principle. Iran transmitted its counter-proposal to the United States through Pakistani intermediaries, and Qatar's Prime Minister Mohammed Al Thani has been working the phones with extraordinary energy, speaking with the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Iran, as well as with Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, in an effort to construct the kind of regional diplomatic consensus that could provide the framework for a durable settlement. This multilateral diplomatic effort, Pakistan as back-channel, Qatar as facilitator, Saudi Arabia as heavyweight guarantor, Egypt as additional Arab voice, represents exactly the kind of patient and layered diplomatic architecture that the current crisis requires. The question is whether the Trump administration, with its preference for bilateral transactionalism and its tendency to evaluate diplomatic proposals primarily through the lens of domestic political optics, is capable of working constructively within this multilateral framework rather than attempting to bypass it in favor of the kind of direct pressure tactics that have thus far produced nothing but hardened Iranian resistance and damaged relationships with Gulf partners. But this is where the situation becomes genuinely more dangerous than most analysts are currently acknowledging, because the economic pressures bearing down on the Trump administration are not static. They are intensifying with every week that the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, and they are creating a political dynamic in Washington that pushes toward escalation rather than toward the patient diplomatic engagement that the situation requires. American consumers are paying over $4.50 per gallon at the pump. The Brown University Iran War Energy Cost Tracker calculates that the war has already imposed more than $280 in additional energy costs on the average American household. The Federal Reserve is watching oil prices with anxiety that has begun to manifest in its public communications. And Trump, whatever his genuine preferences regarding the relative merits of diplomacy versus military action, faces a domestic political constituency that is growing impatient with a war that was sold as quick and decisive and has proven to be neither. What happens in Riyadh over the next several days, what Trump hears from Mohammed bin Salman about the limits of Saudi support for continued American military operations, what commitments he is able to extract regarding Saudi Arabia's willingness to use its relationships with Tehran to advance a negotiated settlement, and what understanding he reaches with Gulf partners about the terms of a ceasefire that both sides might actually honor, will determine whether the Iran war enters a new and more dangerous phase or whether a genuine diplomatic breakthrough remains possible. And that determination, as we shall examine in the second part of our analysis, will be shaped by forces and factors that extend far beyond the gilded palaces of Riyadh. There is a dimension of Trump's Riyadh visit that has received almost no serious analytical attention in the Western press, and it concerns a question that sits at the very heart of the current diplomatic impasse, the question of what Iran actually needs, as opposed to what it is publicly demanding in order to make the kind of concessions that a durable settlement of this conflict will ultimately require. These are not the same thing, and conflating them, as American commentators and American officials have consistently done throughout this crisis, leads to precisely the kind of analytical error that produces failed negotiations and renewed military escalation. What Iran is publicly demanding is well documented: compensation for war damages, recognition of sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, the lifting of sanctions, the release of frozen assets, an end to the American naval blockade, and a cessation of hostilities on all fronts, including Lebanon. These demands have been transmitted through Pakistani intermediaries, discussed in Qatari back channels, and rejected by Trump with characteristic bluntness as totally unacceptable and a piece of garbage. But what Iran actually needs, at the deeper level of national psychology, institutional survival, and strategic calculation, is something more fundamental and more difficult for Washington to provide, which is a credible guarantee that any concessions it makes will not simply expose it to the next round of American or Israeli military action launched during the next round of negotiations. That guarantee is what the entire diplomatic architecture of this crisis has thus far failed to provide, and it is the gap between Iran's public demands and Iran's deeper need that Saudi Arabia, more than any other actor in the current regional constellation, is potentially positioned to help bridge. The historical record on this point is unambiguous and should be stated plainly. Iran has now been attacked by the United States or Israel while engaged in good faith negotiations on two separate occasions in the space of less than a year. The 12-day war of June 2025 was launched while nuclear negotiations were ongoing. Operation Epic Fury of February 2026 was launched while nuclear negotiations were again ongoing, negotiations that had been described by both sides as positive and constructive in their initial stages. From Tehran's perspective, the pattern is not ambiguous. The United States uses negotiations as a cover for intelligence gathering and operational preparation, then strikes when it believes the moment is strategically advantageous, regardless of whatever diplomatic commitments are nominally in place. Iranian officials have said this explicitly and repeatedly, and the evidence supports their characterization with uncomfortable clarity. When Iranian negotiators speak of a cloud of mistrust surrounding their dealings with Washington, they are not engaging in rhetorical posturing. They are describing the lived institutional experience of a state that has been attacked twice during negotiations and that has every rational reason to conclude that making further concessions without ironclad security guarantees would be an act of strategic suicide rather than an act of diplomatic good faith. Saudi Arabia understands this dynamic in a way that Washington does not because Riyadh is sympathetic to Iranian ambitions, but because the kingdom's own strategic experience has given it a nuanced appreciation of how regional actors calculate their security interests when they do not trust the guarantees being offered by external powers. The nuclear dimension of this crisis deserves considerably more honest and careful analysis than it has received in the Western media's coverage of Trump's Middle Eastern tour. Trump claimed last week that Iran is willing to give the United States what he called the nuclear dust, a reference to Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium, and suggested that only China and the United States have the capability to retrieve it. This is a claim of enormous potential significance, but it raises far more questions than it answers, and the manner in which it has been reported as a colorful Trumpism rather than as a serious diplomatic development requiring careful scrutiny reflects the broader failure of Western journalism to engage with the genuine complexity of the Iran nuclear question. If Iran is indeed willing to surrender its enriched uranium stockpile, that represents a concession of real strategic weight. But it is a concession that can only be meaningful within a verification and security framework that gives Tehran confidence that surrendering its ultimate deterrent will not simply expose it to the next round of military pressure, The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear agreement that Iran scrupulously honored, that international inspectors repeatedly certified, and that the United States unilaterally abandoned in 2018, provides the cautionary template here. Iran made significant concessions under that agreement. It accepted intrusive inspections. It reduced its enriched uranium stockpile. It dismantled centrifuges. And in return, it received 8 years of sanctions relief, followed by unilateral American withdrawal from the agreement and the immediate reimposition of the most crushing sanctions in modern history. The lesson that Iranian strategic planners have drawn from that experience is not difficult to understand, and it is a lesson that any serious diplomatic engagement with Tehran must directly address rather than simply dismissing Iranian demands for security guarantees as bad faith obstruction. The role that China plays in this diplomatic landscape, even from the geographical distance of Beijing, is perhaps the most consequential and the least adequately understood dimension of the entire current situation. China is Iran's largest trading partner. It has been purchasing Iranian oil throughout the American sanctions regime, providing Tehran with the economic lifeline that has allowed the Iranian government to function despite years of financial pressure. Iran's supreme leader has personally written to President Xi Jinping a letter carried to Beijing by Foreign Minister Araghchi, emphasizing that Iran's look to the East policy remains a foundational pillar of its foreign relations and will not be altered by any rapprochement with Washington. Trump has imposed new sanctions specifically targeting Iranian oil sales to China, and he has made clear his intention to press Xi to use Chinese leverage over Tehran to advance American negotiating objectives. But this approach fundamentally misreads how Beijing calculates its own strategic interests, and the misreading has consequences that extend well beyond the immediate Iran crisis. China does not want to establish a precedent in which it acts as an enforcer of American foreign policy objectives in exchange for trade concessions, a precedent that would undermine its entire positioning as an alternative pole of the international order, one that offers partnerships without the coercive conditionality that characterizes American relationships. Beijing is watching Trump's Middle Eastern tour with considerable strategic interest, and what it sees, an American president flying to Gulf states to seek help in managing a crisis that American military action created, reinforces rather than undermines the broader Chinese narrative about the limitations and contradictions of American global leadership. The Israeli dimension of Trump's diplomatic challenge adds yet another layer of complexity that his Riyadh visit cannot resolve but cannot ignore. Benjamin Netanyahu has made clear in his CBS interview and in subsequent public statements that Israel's war aims have not been achieved, that Iran continues to support regional proxies, that its enriched uranium stockpile has not been fully accounted for, and that the work of dismantling Iranian military capabilities is, in his assessment, not yet complete. Netanyahu's statement that it is time for Israel to reduce its dependence on American military aid, eventually to zero, has been interpreted in various ways, but its most important strategic implication is this. It signals that Israel does not regard itself as bound by whatever diplomatic framework the United States might negotiate with Iran, and that it reserves the right to pursue its own military objectives in the region regardless of the state of American-Iranian relations. This is an extraordinarily complicating factor for any diplomatic settlement because it means that even if Trump succeeds in negotiating a framework that satisfies American demands regarding Iran's nuclear program and the Strait of Hormuz, Tehran has no guarantee that Israel will not launch its own military operations against Iranian targets in ways that render the broader settlement meaningless. Saudi Arabia understands this Israeli wildcard better than most, and it is one of the reasons that Riyadh has been so careful to maintain its own independent lines of communication with multiple parties rather than simply aligning itself unconditionally with the American-Israeli strategic position. The domestic American political dimension of this crisis, the dimension that ultimately constrains what Trump can and cannot accept in any diplomatic settlement, deserves frank acknowledgement rather than the polite circumspection with which it is typically treated in foreign policy analysis. Trump came to office in his second term, carrying the political brand of the president who launched a bold military campaign against Iran's nuclear program, eliminated the Iranian supreme leader, and delivered what he described as a decisive blow to Iranian military capabilities. That brand requires a settlement that can be presented to his domestic constituency as a victory, as confirmation that the military campaign achieved its stated objectives and that Iran has genuinely capitulated on the issues that matter most to American security. The problem is that the settlement that Iran is capable of accepting, one that preserves Iranian sovereignty, provides security guarantees against future military action, ends the blockade, lifts sanctions, and addresses the Lebanon dimension of the conflict, does not look like the unconditional Iranian surrender that Trump's domestic political narrative requires. Bridging that gap between what Iran can accept and what Trump can sell to his domestic constituency is perhaps the most genuinely difficult diplomatic challenge of the entire crisis. And it is a challenge that Saudi Arabia, with its deep understanding of both American political psychology and Iranian strategic culture, is uniquely positioned to help navigate if Trump is willing to listen to what his hosts are actually telling him rather than simply hearing what he wishes to hear. The deeper truth that emerges from all of these interlocking considerations, the Saudi strategic autonomy, the Iranian need for security guarantees, the Chinese strategic positioning, the Israeli wildcard, the domestic American political constraints, the economic costs of the closed Strait of Hormuz, the fragile and repeatedly violated ceasefire, is that the Iran ceasefire question that hangs over Trump's Middle Eastern visit has no easy answer and no quick solution. It is the product of decades of accumulated mistrust, strategic miscalculation, and the chronic American failure to understand how the world looks from the perspective of those on the receiving end of American power. Saudi Arabia can help. Qatar can facilitate. Pakistan can mediate. China can apply pressure, but none of these actors can substitute for the fundamental shift in American diplomatic approach that a durable resolution of this crisis ultimately requires, a shift from the coercive transactionalism that has characterized Washington's engagement with Tehran for decades toward a genuine acknowledgement that Iran's security concerns are legitimate, that its demands for sovereignty and dignity are not merely negotiating tactics but expressions of deeply held national identity, and that a settlement built on Iranian humiliation rather than Iranian consent will not produce the stable regional order that American interests ultimately require. Whether Donald Trump, standing in the gilded palaces of Riyadh, is capable of that kind of strategic rethinking is the question upon which the future of the Iran ceasefire and much else besides now depends.